Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Tonight's episode steps into quiet American homes, where being home alone slowly stops feeling accidental, and where winter nights stretch longer than expected. Now, let's begin. My name is Michael. I was 31 the winter I stayed alone in my parents' house for a week, not because of any emergency, but because circumstances lined up quietly and left me there. They were out of state visiting family. My own place was unlivable after a plumbing issue, and the weather had turned just bad enough to make commuting impractical. The house sat in a settled neighborhood, wide lawns buried under snow, streetlights spaced far apart. The kind of place where nothing ever seemed urgent. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my bags, turned on a few lamps, and locked the door out of habit, not concern. The house felt familiar in a way that didn't ask anything of me. The layout still made sense to my body. I knew where the light switches were without looking, how many steps there were between rooms, which floorboards creaked and which didn't. I made dinner, ate at the kitchen counter, and let the television play quietly in the living room, more for the sense of occupation than entertainment. Outside, snow fell steadily, dulling the edges of the street until the neighborhood looked smaller, contained. That night passed without incident. The furnace cycled on and off, pipes shifted as they always had. The house settled into its nighttime shape, and I went upstairs feeling relaxed enough to leave lights off behind me. I slept deeply and woke once before dawn, not to a noise, but to a stillness that felt unusually complete. I lay there listening, found nothing out of place, and went back to sleep without thinking about it again. The second evening felt different in ways I couldn't immediately explain. Snow had piled higher during the day, pressing against the base of the windows, sealing the house off from the street. I closed the curtains earlier than usual, not out of unease, but because the outside had stopped offering anything to look at. Inside, the rooms felt warmer once they were cut off, the air thicker, slower to move. I noticed it while washing dishes, how the sound of running water seemed to linger after I shut the faucet. Later, while sitting on the couch, I muted the television and listened. The quiet wasn't new, but it felt rearranged, stretched thinner between sounds. The refrigerator hummed, the clock in the hallway ticked. Everything functioned the way it should have. Still, I found myself sitting more upright, as if waiting for something to follow. I went upstairs to grab a sweatshirt from the hall closet. Halfway up the steps, I paused. There was no noise, no movement to justify it, just the sense that something downstairs had shifted, while I wasn't looking. The feeling wasn't fear exactly, it was closer to realizing you've missed a small action, something subtle but important, and now you're trying to figure out when it happened. When I came back down, the living room looked the same at first glance. Lamps on, couch undisturbed. Then I noticed the dining chair nearest the hallway had been pulled back slightly from the table. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to interrupt the line. I stood there, trying to remember if I'd sat there earlier, if I'd moved it without noticing. No memory came. The uncertainty bothered me more than the chair itself. I pushed it back into place and told myself the house was old, that small displacements were easy to miss. To break the feeling, I turned the television back on and kept the volume low. Outside, the snow continued to fall, steady and quiet, erasing whatever was left of the street. When I went to bed, I turned off the lights downstairs one by one. At the foot of the stairs, I stopped and looked back into the darkened rooms. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt intentional, like a space arranged carefully rather than abandoned. I locked my bedroom door and lay down, listening to the house settle around me. Sleep came slowly. As it did, a thought stayed with me, calm but persistent, refusing to become panic or reason. The house didn't feel unfamiliar, it felt attentive, like it had noticed I was alone and decided that was enough to begin. The first sound I noticed wasn't loud enough to wake me. It slipped into my awareness slowly, the way you notice rain after it has already been falling for a while. I lay still in the dark, listening, trying to decide whether it belonged to the house or to sleep. It came again, faint and deliberate, a soft tapping that seemed to come from the wall beside my bed. Not inside it, not outside it, exactly where my head rested. I counted a few breaths, waiting for it to repeat in a pattern I could explain. It didn't. The taps arrived unevenly, spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional. I told myself it was the pipes, the cold pushing through the siding, something mechanical responding to the temperature shift. The explanation felt thin, but I held on to it because it was available. The tapping stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had been, pressed close to the walls as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I sat up slowly and swung my feet onto the carpet. The heater turned on with a low groan, air spilling from the vent near the door. For a moment, I almost relaxed. Then I noticed the temperature didn't change. The room stayed warm in the same dense way it had been all night, as if the air had already reached its limit. I stood and crossed to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing, no movement in the hallway, no shifting from below. The house felt empty again, and that made the earlier sound harder to dismiss. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The lights were off, but the space wasn't dark. Snowlight leaked in through the small window at the end of the hall, flattening shadows, making distances hard to judge. I walked past the bathroom, past the guest room, listening for any sign that someone else was awake. The tapping didn't return. The house held its breath. Downstairs, the living room looked unchanged. Couch in place, lamps off, curtains closed tight against the night. I stood near the bottom of the stairs, listening. That was when I noticed how still the outside had become. The snow had stopped completely. No wind, no distant cars. The neighborhood felt erased, simplified down to the house and whatever space it occupied. I went to the front door and unlocked it, more curious than cautious. Cold air spilled in immediately, sharp and clean. The porch was smooth with snow. My earlier footprints gone, filled in so cleanly it looked untouched. I stepped outside and scanned the street. No lights in neighboring windows, no movement, just the steady glow of street lamps reflected in white. I turned to go back in and saw it then, down the block near the intersection. A figure stood near the mailbox cluster, half buried in snow. At first, it looked like a neighbor, bundled up, head down against the cold. I raised my hand, considering calling out, then stopped. The figure wasn't moving, not shifting weight, not reacting to the cold. It stood too still, facing the mailboxes, as if listening to something only it could hear. I took a few steps closer before realizing the distance wasn't changing the way it should have. The figure stayed the same size, the same shape, as if perspective had stopped working. A familiar unease settled into my chest, quiet but firm. I backed up slowly and returned inside, locking the door without thinking about it. The moment the door closed, the tapping returned. This time it wasn't beside my bed, it came from the walls around the living room, faint and metallic, spreading outward as if the sound were traveling through the structure itself. Not one place, several. The house carried it easily, the way a building carries heat. I stood there, heart steady but alert, understanding something before I could explain it. The sound wasn't coming from outside the house. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the street come back into existence. It was coming from within it, from the spaces between rooms, the gaps no one ever considers occupied. The tapping continued, patient and precise, until it stopped all at once. The quiet that followed felt expectant. The phone on the kitchen counter lit up. I stared at it, watching the screen glow without ringing, the call already connected. When I lifted it, the line was warm against my ear. "You're awake," a voice said calmly. Not loud, not surprised. "I didn't call," I said. "You don't need to," the voice replied. "We just needed to know." The line went dead, the screen went dark. Outside, a single porch light down the street turned on, then another, illuminating nothing at all. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, aware now that the house hadn't been waiting for noise or movement, it had been waiting for my attention. I didn't sleep after that. I lay on the couch with the lights off, blanket pulled up to my chest, listening to the house settle into a quiet that felt earned rather than accidental. The tapping didn't return, but the silence it left behind stayed fixed, like a pressure that didn't need to announce itself again. Every sound the house made after that arrived on time and then stopped, as if following a schedule I wasn't meant to see. Morning came slowly, the sky lightened behind the curtains without color, winter daylight spreading thin and flat. When I stood up, my body felt rested in a way that didn't match the night I'd had. The house looked ordinary again, too ordinary. I walked through the rooms deliberately, checking things I didn't expect to find wrong. Chairs were tucked in, doors were closed, nothing had shifted. The absence of evidence felt less reassuring than the chair had the night before. A car passed, a neighbor stepped out to clear their driveway. The mailbox cluster at the corner looked exactly as it always had. No figure, no disturbance. If I hadn't seen it myself, I could have convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. That afternoon, I tried to leave. I packed my bag, pulled on my coat, and reached for my keys, only to realize they weren't where I'd left them. I searched calmly at first, then more carefully. Kitchen counter, couch cushions, the small table by the door. When I finally found them, they were on my nightstand upstairs, placed neatly beside my phone. I didn't remember bringing them there. I didn't argue with the placement either. I picked them up and went back downstairs without comment. As evening settled in, the house grew quieter again, but this time it felt different. Not watchful, not expectant, it felt settled, like something that had finished asking its questions. I noticed small changes then, things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the light switches clicked more softly, the way the furnace cycled on exactly when the room cooled, not a second late. The way my movement slowed without effort, matching the house rather than moving through it. The tapping didn't return that night, neither did the call. Instead, there was a steady sense of being accounted for, a calm awareness that nothing needed to announce itself anymore. I slept in my bed with the door unlocked, and woke just before dawn, alert but unafraid, as if my body had learned a new rule without being told. When morning came, I left the house easily. My keys were where they belonged. The door locked behind me with a clean, final sound. Driving away, I watched the house shrink in the mirror, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of place no one would ever think twice about. It looked empty. That was the part that stayed with me. Weeks later, back in my own apartment, I noticed the habit lingered. I paused longer before entering rooms. I listened for spaces between sounds. Sometimes, late at night, when everything went still at once, I felt that same pressure settle in, familiar now, almost polite. Not a demand, not a warning, just confirmation. The house hadn't wanted me to leave, it hadn't wanted me to stay either. It had only needed me to notice it, long enough to learn how attention changes a place. And how, once you learn that, being alone never feels quite as empty again. I stayed alone in that apartment, because everyone else left at the same time. The building was scheduled for renovations that never quite began, and one by one the tenants moved out until the floors emptied without ceremony. I was the last name on the list, not because I insisted on staying, but because my lease ended later and no one seemed in a hurry to change it. The management company stopped answering emails, then stopped leaving notices, and eventually stopped appearing at all. By the time winter settled in, the building felt paused rather than abandoned, like it was waiting for a decision it didn't know how to make. The apartment itself was ordinary. One bedroom, narrow kitchen, windows that looked out onto a courtyard no one used anymore. I moved through it easily, keeping lights on in rooms I occupied, shutting them off when I didn't. At night, the building made sounds that felt familiar enough to ignore, pipes ticking, distant wind brushing the exterior, the low hum of electricity moving through walls meant to hold many lives at once. I slept well at first, comforted by the idea that emptiness was temporary, that this was just a gap between uses. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of the elevator. It arrived on my floor one night without being called, doors opening and closing once before continuing down. I stood in the hallway watching it leave, annoyed more than unsettled, assuming a wiring issue or a delayed command from someone, still living below. The explanation held until it happened again the next night, and then again, always around the same time, always stopping on my floor before moving on. I adjusted my routine without thinking about it. I stayed inside after dark, I used the stairs instead. The building felt calmer when I did, as if my movements had been interfering with something already in progress. The lights in the hall flickered less, the elevator stayed away. It felt less like a fix, and more like compliance. A week later, the mailboxes were emptied. Not just mine, all of them. I noticed it because the metal doors hung open, revealing rows of empty slots, labels still taped in place. No envelopes, no flyers, no explanation. I closed mine gently and went back upstairs, aware that the building hadn't removed the boxes themselves, only their purpose. That night, the heat cycled differently. Instead of coming on in bursts, it moved steadily, a low warmth that never quite peaked or faded. The air felt thick, contained, like it had been measured and approved. I opened a window for a few minutes just to feel movement, then closed it when the cold pressed in too quickly. Somewhere in the walls, something adjusted in response. I began to notice doors on other floors opening and closing at night. Not slamming, not creaking, just the clean sound of hinges doing their job. Footsteps followed sometimes, spaced evenly, never hurried. I didn't hear voices, I didn't hear anyone enter or leave the building. The sound stayed inside, circulating like checks being performed in a place that still believed it was occupied. One evening, I found a notice taped to my door. No letterhead, no logo, just a single sheet of paper printed in neutral type. Please remain within your unit after 10 p.m. There was no signature, no date. I read it twice, not because it confused me, but because it felt familiar, like a rule I had agreed to earlier and forgotten. I peeled it off and placed it on the kitchen counter, telling myself I'd ask about it in the morning. The next day, the stairwell lights stayed on continuously. The elevator stopped visiting my floor. The hall outside my door felt quieter, as if movement had been rerouted elsewhere. I stayed inside after 10 without needing to check the time. The building seemed to know when I was, where I should be. Late that night, while brushing my teeth, I heard a sound from the hallway. Not footsteps, not voices. A brief pause, followed by the soft click of something being noted. I stood still, listening, aware that the sound hadn't been searching, it had been confirming. I went to bed with the lights off, and the notice still on the counter. Sleep came slowly, as it did, a realization settled in, calm and unwelcome. The building wasn't empty, it was reducing itself, narrowing its focus until only what mattered remained, and for reasons it hadn't explained, I was still included. The second phase arrived without a clear beginning, which made it harder to measure and easier to accept. I noticed it first in the way the building stopped reacting to me, and started anticipating me instead. The hall lights came on before I opened my door. The heat adjusted itself a few minutes before the apartment cooled. Even the sounds shifted, arriving slightly ahead of my awareness, like echoes that came before the movement that caused them. I told myself this was coincidence, the byproduct of living in a place designed for more people than it currently held, but the explanation felt increasingly like something I was repeating rather than believing. The notice stayed on my counter. I didn't throw it away, I didn't put it back on the door either. It remained where I could see it while I cooked, while I washed dishes, while I stood by the sink at night listening to the building breathe around me. 10 o'clock passed each evening without ceremony. I stayed inside without checking the time. The apartment felt calmer when I did, the kind of calm that comes from alignment rather than quiet. A few nights later, the elevator returned. I heard it stop on my floor while I was sitting on the couch, the soft chime muffled through the door. It didn't open. It waited, I stayed where I was, aware that standing up might register as a response. After a minute, the elevator continued downward, satisfied. The hall lights dimmed again, and the building resumed its low, even hum. I began to dream about the other apartments. Not about people, just about rooms, lit and unlit, doors closed or slightly ajar, furniture arranged carefully beneath sheets of dust. In the dreams, I moved through them without opening anything, simply noting their status, aware of which spaces were active, and which had fallen behind. When I woke, the feeling stayed with me, a sense of having performed some quiet task without being asked. The mailboxes disappeared entirely the following week. Not removed, not damaged, just gone. The alcove where they had been was clean and empty, the wall behind them lighter where metal had once been mounted. No notices appeared, no one asked questions. I realized then that the building wasn't emptying itself randomly, it was streamlining, reducing points of contact, narrowing the number of things that required acknowledgement. One evening, as I returned from work just before 10, I noticed a new sign taped beside the stairwell door. Stairs closed after 10 p.m., please use designated routes. There was no arrow, no map, no explanation of what the designated routes were. I didn't test it, I went upstairs to my apartment and stayed there. The elevator did not arrive that night. The building felt balanced, its system settled into something quieter and more precise. The checking became more obvious after that. Not sounds, not movement, but absences that corrected themselves. A light I forgot to turn on in the kitchen, flicked to life sometime after midnight. A window I cracked for air was closed by morning, latched carefully, the cold kept out without my involvement. None of it felt invasive, it felt corrective, the way a routine adjusts when you miss a step. The phone rang one night just after 10. Not my cell, the old wall phone by the door, the one I hadn't used since moving in. I let it ring twice before answering, already aware that hesitation was being measured. The voice on the other end was calm and unhurried. "Your presence has been noted," it said. "Thank you for remaining available." I didn't ask who was calling. The question felt unnecessary, the line went dead without goodbye. The building exhaled, a soft shift of air moving through vents and walls, and the lights dimmed in sequence down the hall. After that, I stopped thinking about leaving. Not consciously, the idea simply stopped presenting itself as an option that required consideration. My lease date came and went without notice. No bills arrived, no emails followed up. The building no longer referenced time in a way that applied to me. Nights passed cleanly, days felt suspended, useful only insofar as they led back to evening. I understood then that the building wasn't waiting for tenants to return, it was adapting to fewer variables, refining its focus until only what it needed remained. And as long as I stayed where I was expected to be, available and accounted for, it would continue to function smoothly, quietly, without requiring anything more from me than presence. By the third phase, the building no longer felt like something I was living inside. It felt like something I was contributing to, the way a single moving part contributes to a machine without ever seeing the whole of it. My days continued outwardly unchanged. I went to work, I came home, I cooked simple meals and slept regular hours. What shifted was the way the building held those actions, smoothing their edges, reducing friction until nothing felt wasted or excessive. The notices stopped appearing, they were no longer necessary. I knew where I was expected to be and when. After 10, I stayed inside. Not because of fear or obedience, but because the idea of leaving felt poorly timed, like standing up in the middle of a song you hadn't finished hearing. The hallway outside my door remained dim and quiet, its lights adjusting themselves without instruction. The elevator never stopped on my floor anymore. It didn't need to, I was already accounted for. I began to notice how the building handled mistakes. One night, distracted and tired, I left the bathroom light off. I realized it only when I woke hours later to find a thin line of light, spilling under the door. The bulb hummed softly, steady and approved. Another time, I forgot to close the bedroom window before bed. In the morning, it was shut and latched, the curtain resting exactly as it should have. These corrections didn't feel invasive, they felt anticipatory, as if the building understood the outcome better than I did. The other floors went silent completely. No doors, no footsteps, no elevators moving above or below. The absence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt finalized. When I pressed my ear to the wall one night, listening for any trace of life, all I heard was a low, even vibration, the sound of systems running efficiently with no interruptions left to manage. The dreams changed too. I no longer walked through other apartments. Instead, I stood still while rooms around me adjusted themselves, lights switching on and off, doors opening just enough to register activity before closing again. I wasn't directing anything, I was witnessing it, aware that my awareness itself was part of the process. When I woke, I felt rested, clear, as if I had been useful without having to act. One evening, as I was washing dishes, the old wall phone rang again. I dried my hands and answered on the first ring. "There's been an update," the voice said calmly. It sounded the same as before, neither familiar nor distant. "Your unit has been designated stable." I waited for more, nothing followed. "What does that mean?" I asked. A pause, brief and measured. "It means no further adjustments are required at this time." The line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver, aware that this was the first question I had asked in days. The building didn't react, it didn't need to. The answer had already been recorded. A few mornings later, I woke to sunlight filling the apartment more fully than it ever had before. The courtyard outside my window looked different, cleaner somehow, its edges sharper. The door across the hall, the one that had been sealed for weeks, stood open. Inside, the apartment was empty, stripped down to bare floors and blank walls, as if it had never been lived in at all. By evening, the door was closed again, the space had been resolved. My lease paperwork appeared on the kitchen table that night. Not mailed, not slid under the door, just placed there, neatly stacked, my name printed where it belonged. The end date was gone, in its place was a single word, continued. I read it once and set it aside, understanding that time was no longer the metric being used. I thought about leaving then, seriously, for the first time in weeks. I stood by the door with my coat on, keys in hand, listening. The building remained quiet. No alarms, no warnings, no resistance. The absence of response unsettled me more than any notice ever had. I realized that leaving wasn't forbidden, it was simply unnecessary. I took my coat off and hung it back up. The lights dimmed slightly, acknowledging the correction. Now, when night falls, the building settles into its rhythm, and I settle with it. I no longer listen for sounds, I listen for balance. Somewhere above me or below me, systems continue their quiet work, confident and contained. I don't know how many units are still active, I don't know if I'm the last one, I only know that the building no longer checks on me because it doesn't need to. I'm here when I'm expected to be, and the building is complete because of it. I stayed alone in that house, because no one thought it counted as living there anymore. It belonged to my older brother, a place he had already decided to sell once winter passed, but until then it needed someone to keep the heat running, and the pipes from freezing. He lived 3 states away, trusted me with a key, and framed it as a favor rather than a responsibility. I agreed, because I had nowhere urgent to be, and because the house was familiar enough to feel neutral, a structure in transition rather than a home that still expected anything from its occupants. The house sat at the edge of a newer development, surrounded by empty lots dusted with snow, and streets that hadn't learned traffic yet. Inside, it felt staged. Furniture placed deliberately but never used, cabinets half-filled, closets empty except for hangers, that slid too easily when touched. I moved in with one bag, told myself I'd only be there a few nights at a time, and left most of the rooms untouched. The heat came on when it was supposed to, the lights worked. Nothing protested my presence. For the first few days, I treated the house the way you treat a borrowed car. I stayed in one room, I avoided opening drawers. I didn't linger anywhere I didn't need to be. At night, I slept on the couch instead of the bedroom, telling myself it wasn't worth unpacking when I'd be leaving soon. The house stayed quiet, almost grateful, as if relieved I wasn't trying to settle in. The change didn't begin with a sound, it began with a correction. One morning, I woke to find the bedroom door open. I hadn't been in there since arriving. The bed was still made, the comforter pulled tight, pillows untouched. I stood in the doorway for a moment, mildly annoyed, then closed it again without thinking much about it. Old houses shifted, doors moved, the explanation was easy. The next night, I slept on the couch again. When I woke, the bedroom light was on. I noticed it from the hallway, a thin line of illumination spilling beneath the door. The switch inside was flipped all the way up, bright enough to light the entire room. I stood there longer than I needed to, waiting for something else to happen, then reached in and turned it off. The house settled back into darkness immediately, like it had been waiting for the adjustment. After that, the corrections became more specific. A lamp turned on in the dining room after sunset, even though I hadn't gone in there. The hallway light stayed on through the night unless I switched it off myself. When I forgot to turn it back on the following evening, it corrected itself again sometime after midnight. There was no pattern I could point to, only the sense that certain spaces were being kept active, whether I acknowledged them or not. I started closing doors more deliberately, as if that might limit whatever was happening. It didn't. The house responded by opening them again, always slightly, never enough to feel aggressive. Just enough to undo my decision. I stopped leaving lights off in unused rooms. That seemed to help. The house stayed quiet when everything was lit, as if darkness itself had become the problem. One evening, I checked the breaker panel, half expecting to find something wrong. Everything was normal. No tripped switches, no irregularities. When I closed the panel, I noticed a faint warmth coming from the hallway ceiling, as if heat were being directed there specifically. I didn't touch it, I didn't need to. I slept in the bedroom that night for the first time. The bed felt unused in a way that made my skin prickle, sheets too smooth, air too still. I left the door open and the light on low, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because the house seemed to prefer it that way. Sleep came unevenly. I woke several times with the sense that I had missed something small but important. In the early morning, I found the couch blanket folded neatly on the armrest, aligned as if it had been used and put away. I stood there holding my coffee, staring at it, trying to remember doing that myself. The memory didn't arrive. By then, it was clear the house wasn't reacting to me being alone, it was reacting to me not using it fully. Rooms left untouched, spaces left dark, functions left idle. The house wasn't haunted, it was incomplete. And somewhere along the way, without asking, it had decided I was there to finish it. The house leaned into that decision quietly. Once I started using the bedroom, it adjusted the rest of itself as if confirming a checklist. The dining room light came on earlier in the evening, steady and warm. The hallway stayed lit through the night without flickering. Even the thermostat shifted by a degree, just enough that the air felt evenly distributed instead of pooling in the rooms I occupied. Nothing announced these changes. They arrived already settled, like corrections made while I wasn't watching. I tried to push back in small ways. I ate dinner in the kitchen instead of the dining room, and left the table untouched. When I came back later, the chairs had been pulled out slightly, not enough to suggest use, just enough to suggest readiness. I pushed them back in and felt a faint resistance in the movement, like the floor beneath them had already accounted for a different position. The feeling passed quickly, leaving only the sense that I'd undone something temporary rather than asserted a choice. That night, I heard movement upstairs. It wasn't footsteps in the usual sense. There was no weight to it, no rhythm, just the soft shift of pressure, as if someone were moving from room to room without crossing the space between them. I stayed in bed and listened, aware that the sounds never entered the bedroom. They circled it instead, pausing near the door, then continuing on. The house wasn't checking if I was there, it already knew, it was checking everything else. In the morning, the bedroom closet was open. I hadn't gone near it. Inside, the hangers were spaced evenly, no longer clustered together the way they had been when I first arrived. The light inside the closet was on, casting a pale glow onto the carpet. I turned it off and closed the door, then stood there longer than necessary, waiting to see if it would reopen. It didn't. The silence that followed felt measured, not relieved. I began to understand that the house responded better when I anticipated it. If I moved through the rooms deliberately, opening doors before nightfall, turning lights on at dusk, the corrections slowed. The house seemed satisfied when every space had been acknowledged, even briefly. The problem wasn't solitude, it was neglect. Rooms left idle long enough began to draw attention. That afternoon, a realtor's sign appeared in the front yard. I hadn't seen anyone place it there. The ground around it was smooth, the snow undisturbed. The sign listed a number I recognized as my brother's. I called him immediately, unsettled more by the timing than the sign itself. He sounded surprised. He hadn't listed the house yet, he said he would handle it when spring came. I told him about the sign. He paused, then said maybe the city had put it up by mistake. Neither of us sounded convinced. When I hung up, the house felt different. Not reactive, expectant. That night, I moved through every room before bed. I turned on lamps, opened doors, stood briefly in each space as if taking attendance. The house stayed quiet, its air even, its warmth steady. I slept deeply and woke once to find the hallway light brighter than I remembered leaving it. I didn't adjust it. I rolled over and went back to sleep, understanding that the house was still arranging itself. In the morning, the realtor's sign was gone. In its place was a thin path through the snow, leading from the street to the front door, the only disturbed ground in the yard. I stood at the window looking at it, aware that the house had responded not to the idea of being sold, but to the suggestion of being left and used again. It wasn't resisting change, it was managing continuity. That evening, I stopped treating the house like something temporary. I unpacked my bag fully, I filled the closets, I used the dining room table, I let the light stay on in rooms I wasn't in. The house responded by growing quieter than it had ever been, its movements reduced to the ordinary sounds of heat and structure. I realized then that the house didn't want a caretaker, it wanted an occupant. Someone to complete its layout, to justify every room by using it. And the longer I stayed, the more it adjusted itself around me, less like a place waiting to be sold and more like a place that had decided, it wasn't finished with its last resident yet. By the third night, the house no longer corrected me in ways I could observe. The lights stayed where I left them. Doors remained open or closed according to my last decision. The thermostat held steady without drifting. That absence of adjustment unsettled me more than the earlier changes had, because it suggested the house had moved past reacting and into remembering. It no longer needed to test what I would do, it had already learned the pattern. I noticed it in the way the rooms felt fuller, even when I wasn't in them. Walking down the hallway, I had the sense that each space was already occupied by its purpose, like a stage set between performances. The dining room felt active even when empty. The spare room carried a weight it hadn't before, the air slightly warmer, the light softer, as if it expected to be entered at any moment. I stopped turning lights off entirely. Darkness began to feel like a withdrawal rather than rest. The house started waking before I did. I would open my eyes in the early morning, and realize the kitchen light was already on, the coffee maker warm to the touch without having brewed anything. Once, I found the shower steaming faintly, water off but heat lingering in the tiles. These weren't malfunctions. Nothing broke, nothing wasted energy. Each change felt economical, purposeful, like the house was preparing itself ahead of time rather than waiting for instruction. I thought about leaving again, seriously this time. The idea surfaced while I was standing in the living room, looking at the way the furniture now felt properly placed, as if it had been waiting for final confirmation. I picked up my phone and checked the weather, hoping for a reason, any excuse that felt external. Snow was expected overnight, roads would be fine, no urgency. The house stayed quiet, unopposed. That evening, I tried something small. I closed the dining room door and turned off the light. I went back to the couch and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing happened, no correction, no sound. The silence grew thick enough that I started checking the clock without meaning to. When I finally stood and walked back to the dining room, the door was still closed, the light still off. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, hollow in a way it hadn't before. I opened the door and turned the light back on. The temperature equalized almost immediately, warmth flowing back into the space like water finding its level. Somewhere above me, the ceiling creaked softly, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. I stood there longer than necessary, aware that I hadn't been testing the house. I had been restoring something it had already decided was correct. That night, I slept deeply. No half-waking, no sense of interruption. When I dreamed, the house wasn't empty or active. It was complete, each room filled with a quiet presence that didn't move or watch, only remained. I woke before dawn with the certainty that if I left now, something would be left unfinished. In the morning, my brother called. He said he had decided to delay the sale. The market wasn't right, maybe he'd rent it out later in the year. He asked if I was okay staying a while longer. I said yes before thinking about it, the answer arriving easily, like it had already been accounted for. After the call, I noticed how little of the house still felt unused. Every room carried signs of routine now. A glass left on a table, a jacket over a chair, shoes by the door that felt permanent rather than temporary. The house no longer adjusted these things, it incorporated them. That afternoon, the empty lots outside filled with light as the snow reflected the sky. The house looked ordinary from the street, staged in the way all lived-in homes are staged, quietly convincing. Nothing about it suggested correction or insistence. Inside, the air felt settled, balanced, as if every space had finally been justified. I understood then, that the house hadn't needed someone to watch it or protect it, it needed to be used completely, without hesitation or restraint. Partial living had created gaps, gaps had drawn attention, now there were none left to manage. I still think about that house sometimes, especially when I leave rooms dark in my own place, or close doors I don't plan to open again. I notice how quickly spaces thin when they're ignored, how easily a house can feel unfinished. Once you learn that, it's hard not to respond. Some houses don't haunt you because they're empty, they haunt you because they're waiting to be finished. I stayed alone in that house, because it was my job to do so. The place belonged to my aunt, a narrow farmhouse set back from the road, surrounded by winter fields that never seemed to end. She had been taken to the hospital after a fall, nothing life-threatening, but enough that someone needed to stay behind, and keep the house running until spring came back into the world. I was between jobs, nearby, and familiar enough with the place that no one worried about it. Being alone there didn't feel brave or strange, it felt practical. The house had its own order. One floor, long hall. Rooms arranged side by side, each with a purpose that hadn't changed in decades. The furnace room at the far end, the spare bedroom that was never used, the back door that stayed locked even during the day. When I arrived, I turned on the lights, checked the thermostat, and went through the motions my aunt had always followed, as if repeating them would keep everything steady, until she returned. The first 2 nights passed cleanly. I slept well, woke early, fed the outdoor cat that appeared at dawn, and vanished before sunset. The field stayed white and still, the sky pale and distant. The house made its usual sounds, boards settling, heat moving through vents, nothing that asked for attention. I moved through the rooms without thinking, carrying a mug from counter to table, switching lights off behind me, leaving doors open, because no one else needed them closed. On the 3rd evening, the power flickered just once. Not long enough to shut anything down, just a brief dimming that reset the clocks. I noticed it only because the house felt different afterward, as if it had paused and resumed without telling me why. I reset the microwave, checked the lamps, and sat back down. Outside, the fields held their silence, snow pressed smooth against fence posts and buried the road so completely, it looked unused. Later that night, I heard the back door open. Not slam, not creak, just the soft, unmistakable sound of it unlatching, followed by a draft of cold air moving down the hall. I stood up immediately, heart steady but alert, listening for the next sound. Footsteps never came, the door didn't close. It stayed exactly as it was, open just enough to let the cold in. I walked down the hall slowly, stopping a few steps short of the doorway. The porch light was on, casting a thin rectangle across the snow. The cat wasn't there, the fields beyond the porch were empty. No tracks, no marks, just smooth white, uninterrupted. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the house settle back into itself. I told myself it was my fault, that I had forgotten to lock it earlier. That responsibility makes you imagine consequences that never happened. The explanation fit well enough to carry me through the night. The next morning, I found the back door unlocked again. This time, it was fully closed, locked the way it should have been. I checked the latch twice, it held. The cold had not gotten in, nothing else looked disturbed. Still, the certainty sat with me all day, quiet and firm. I had not opened it, and whatever had done so carefully. That evening, I stopped leaving doors open. I moved through the house more deliberately, closing rooms I wasn't using, turning lights off sooner than before. The habit felt natural, like something I had been slow to remember. When I went to bed, I made sure the hallway light was off, not because I needed darkness, but because the house seemed to expect it. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of air moving through the vents. Not heat, not wind, something slower, traveling the length of the house, pausing briefly at each doorway before continuing on. I stayed still, listening, aware that the sound wasn't searching. It was checking. The checking continued the next night, but it changed its pace. I noticed it while washing dishes, the way the sound moved through the vents in short, measured passes, stopping longer near some rooms than others. It didn't grow louder when it paused, it simply lingered, as if marking time. I dried my hands slowly and stood still, listening, trying to decide whether it was heat redistributing, or pressure shifting in the pipes. The explanation worked until it reached the spare bedroom and stopped completely. That room had always been kept closed. Not locked, just unused, holding furniture wrapped in sheets, and the smell of dust that never quite left. My aunt had never said not to go in there, she also never did. I stood in the hallway watching the door, half expecting it to move, it didn't. After a while, the sound resumed and traveled on, reaching the furnace room before fading out entirely. The house returned to its baseline quiet, and I realized my shoulders had tightened without my noticing. The next morning, I found the spare bedroom door open. Not wide, just enough to break the line of the hallway. The air inside felt colder than the rest of the house, heavy and still, like it had been sealed off for a reason I had forgotten. I didn't go in. I closed the door gently and stood there, hand on the knob, aware that the action felt corrective rather than curious. That afternoon, the cat didn't show up. The bowl I left on the porch remained untouched, the food slowly frosting over in the cold. I told myself animals move on when routines change, even slightly. Still, the porch felt watched in a way it hadn't before. The light stayed on longer than necessary. I didn't turn it off. That night, the sound came again, clearer this time. It didn't travel through the vents, it moved through the hallway itself, a soft displacement of air, stopping briefly outside each door. When it reached my bedroom, it paused longer than it had anywhere else. I held my breath, not out of fear, but out of an instinctive sense that interruption would be noted. After a moment, it moved on, continuing down the hall toward the spare room. I didn't follow it, I didn't need to. I already knew where it would stop. In the morning, the spare bedroom door was closed again, locked. The key hung on the hook beside the furnace room, where it had always been, though I couldn't remember seeing it there before. I touched it lightly, just enough to confirm it was real, then left it where it was. I began to understand then that the house wasn't responding to intrusion, it was responding to vacancy. Rooms left unused, spaces unobserved, routines that thinned out over time. The doors weren't opening on their own, they were being reopened to maintain balance. That evening, I changed the pattern. I opened the spare bedroom door before the sound could arrive. I stood in the doorway and let the light spill inside, illuminating the covered furniture, the old dresser, the narrow bed that had never been slept in. The air shifted almost immediately, moving past me down the hall, adjusting to the change without resistance. The checking didn't happen that night. I slept deeply and woke before dawn, the house quiet and even. For the first time since arriving, nothing felt out of place. The silence felt neutral again, no longer attentive. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen, watching the fields lighten slowly, thinking I had solved something. That afternoon, the phone rang. It wasn't mine, it was the old landline in the hallway, the one my aunt never used and never unplugged. I stared at it until it stopped, the sound echoing faintly down the house. When it rang again, I picked it up. "You're doing well," a calm voice said. "Just keep the rooms active." The line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver, aware that I hadn't been correcting a problem at all, I had been meeting a requirement. The house hadn't been checking to see who was there, it had been checking to see who wasn't. By the third night, the routine had settled into something that felt almost reasonable. I moved through the house with intention, opening doors I didn't need, turning lights on in rooms I wasn't using, letting presence linger where absence had been before. The spare bedroom stayed lit until morning. The furnace room door remained ajar. Even the back porch light stayed on, casting its thin rectangle across the snow long after darkness fell. The house responded by staying quiet, its movements reduced to the ordinary sounds of heat and structure, nothing more. I told myself this was temporary. That once my aunt came home, the house would slip back into its older habits, and whatever balance I had restored would no longer be required. The thought helped me sleep, even as it felt less convincing each time I repeated it. On the fourth morning, the cat returned. It sat on the porch as if it had never left, watching the door without impatience. When I opened it, the animal didn't move until I stepped aside, then walked in slowly, tracking melted snow across the floor before settling near the heater. It stayed there all day, eyes half closed, present in a way that felt deliberate. That night, the checking didn't happen. No sound in the hall, no air shifting through vents. The house felt full. The phone rang again just before dawn. I answered it without waiting for the second ring. "You can rest tonight," the voice said. "Everything's accounted for." I didn't ask what would happen next. The question felt irrelevant, the line went dead, and the house stayed quiet, its silence even and unremarkable. Later that day, the hospital called to say my aunt would be staying longer than expected. Recovery would take time. Weeks, maybe months. I thanked them and hung up, standing in the kitchen with the receiver still warm in my hand. The house didn't react. It didn't need to, it had already adjusted. That evening, I made a small change. I closed the spare bedroom door and turned off the light. I waited, nothing happened. The silence held. Encouraged, I turned off the porch light next. Still nothing, the house remained calm, its air steady, its rooms quiet. I went to bed believing I had finally learned the limit. I woke in the middle of the night to find the hallway light on. Not bright, just enough to mark the space. I stood in the doorway of my room and listened. There was no movement, no checking, just the soft hum of electricity moving where it had been restored. When I went back to sleep, I left my door open. In the morning, the spare bedroom was lit again, the porch light was on. The doors I had closed were open, each adjusted just enough to correct the absence I had introduced. The cat watched me from the kitchen floor, unbothered. I understood then that the house no longer needed my decisions, it had learned the pattern. Presence wasn't something I supplied anymore, it was something the house maintained on its own. When my aunt eventually returned, she thanked me for keeping the place in good order. She said it felt warm, lived in, the way it always had. I didn't correct her. I moved out a week later, taking my things with me, leaving the doors as I found them. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that house and wonder if it still checks its rooms, or if it has learned to manage without asking. I know now that being alone isn't what unsettles a place, it's leaving spaces unattended for too long. Once a house learns that lesson, it doesn't forget. I stayed alone in that house because my wife worked nights. It wasn't unusual, and it wasn't something we ever talked about as isolation. She was a nurse at a long-term care facility an hour away, 12-hour shifts that blurred into one another. And during winter it made more sense for her to sleep there between rotations. I stayed home, kept the place running, and waited for mornings the way I always had. Being alone wasn't the point, it was just how the schedule worked. The house itself was small, newer than the others on the street, built efficiently and without wasted space. One floor, open living area, bedroom at the back, doors that closed softly and stayed where you left them. At night, I kept only a few lights on, enough to mark the rooms I used. I cooked late dinners, washed dishes slowly, and let the television play quietly, while the rest of the neighborhood darkened around me. Nothing about it felt eerie, it felt routine. The first sign that the routine had shifted was subtle enough that I dismissed it immediately. I came home one night to find the porch light already on. I assumed my wife had forgotten to turn it off before leaving earlier that afternoon, even though she usually worked nights, not days. I turned it off, stepped inside, and didn't think about it again until the next evening, when it was on again. This time, I knew she hadn't been home. I turned it off more deliberately, standing there a moment longer, listening to the quiet street before closing the door. The light came back on sometime after midnight. I noticed it through the living room window, the glow steady and warm against the snow. I told myself it was a sensor issue, something reacting to motion or temperature, and made a mental note to check it in the morning. When I did, nothing looked wrong. The switch worked, the wiring was intact. That night, the light stayed off. I let myself forget about it. A few days later, I started noticing other things staying active longer than necessary. The hallway light remained on after I went to bed. The kitchen radio, which I sometimes used while cooking, clicked on by itself at low volume, and stayed there until I turned it off. None of it felt intrusive, it felt cautious, like the house was keeping itself awake just in case. I didn't mention it to my wife, there was no reason to. These were small things, easy to rationalize, and I was tired enough most nights that I didn't want to add meaning, where none was required. Still, I found myself moving more deliberately through the house, turning lights off with intention, checking rooms before settling in, as if leaving something active felt wasteful or wrong. One night, while standing in the kitchen, I realized I hadn't heard the house settle the way it usually did. No distant clicks, no cooling sounds. Everything held steady, as if it were waiting for me to finish what I was doing. I turned off the radio and stood there in the quiet, aware that the silence felt occupied rather than empty. When I finally went to bed, I left the bedroom door open. Not because I was uneasy, but because closing it felt like removing myself from something that expected to be acknowledged. Sleep came slowly. I woke once to the soft sound of movement, not footsteps, just a shift in the air, and realized the living room light was on again. I didn't get up to turn it off. The effort felt unnecessary. In the morning, the house looked normal. Lights off, radio silent, everything exactly where it should have been. If it weren't for the lingering sense that something had been adjusted while I slept, I could have convinced myself nothing had happened at all. That afternoon, my wife called during her break and apologized for being gone so much. She said she hated leaving me alone every night. I told her it was fine, I meant it. But after we hung up, I stood in the quiet kitchen and understood something I hadn't before. The house didn't react when I was alone, it reacted when it thought I shouldn't have been. The next few nights confirmed that realization without announcing it. Whenever my wife was scheduled to be home, the house stayed inert, lights responding only when touched, sounds arriving and fading the way they always had. On the nights she worked late, things stayed active longer than necessary, as if the house were resisting the idea of settling before everyone was accounted for. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, rooms remained lit, appliances stayed warm. The silence never fully arrived. I began to notice how closely the changes followed her schedule. On evenings when she called to say she'd be staying overnight at the facility, the porch light came on before dusk, even if I was still in the living room. The hallway light followed shortly after, steady and unobtrusive. When she was due home, everything behaved. The house waited properly. It was the difference that unsettled me, not the behavior itself. One night, I tested it without meaning to. She was supposed to be back before midnight, but a snowstorm slowed traffic and she called to say she'd be late. While we were still on the phone, I heard the faint click of the hallway light turning on behind me. She hadn't even hung up yet. I stood there listening, phone pressed to my ear, aware that the house had responded to information it shouldn't have had access to. I didn't say anything to her. I finished the call and went about my evening, turning lights off as I normally would. The house corrected me each time, bringing them back on after I left the room. Not immediately, not aggressively, just enough to undo the change. It felt less like defiance and more like insistence, a quiet refusal to acknowledge my adjustments as final. Sleep became uneven after that. I wasn't kept awake by noise, but by the sense that the house was never fully at rest. I would wake in the early morning hours, and find the living room light glowing beneath the bedroom door, the radio on low volume, the same station it always defaulted to. When I got up to turn it off, it felt warm, as if it had been used recently, even though the house remained otherwise still. The first time I found the second pillow laid out on the bed, I stood there longer than necessary. I didn't remember putting it there, I was certain I hadn't. It wasn't arranged carefully, it was simply present, aligned with the other one, flattening the empty space beside me as if it had never been vacant at all. I removed it and set it on the chair. When I returned later, it was back on the bed. I started staying up later, not out of fear, but out of a growing sense that going to sleep while the house remained active was premature. The later it got, the more the house seemed to hold itself together, light steady, warmth even, everything awake without being loud. It felt like being the last person in a room, where a meeting hadn't officially ended yet. One evening, my wife surprised me by coming home early. I heard her car in the driveway and felt immediate relief, the kind that arrives before you understand why you needed it. As soon as the door opened, the house shifted, lights dimmed, the radio clicked off. The air settled into a familiar quiet that hadn't been present in days. She didn't notice anything unusual, she never did. That night, the house slept properly for the first time in weeks. The pattern became impossible to ignore after that. Whenever she was present, the house relaxed, when she wasn't, it compensated. Not by creating noise or movement, but by refusing to let things go inactive. It treated absence as a temporary error, something to be corrected until resolved. I considered telling her, I even rehearsed how I might explain it, framing it as wiring issues or faulty sensors. Each time, the explanation felt dishonest, not because it was wrong, but because it missed the point. The house wasn't malfunctioning, it was managing a condition. One night, while she was away again, the phone rang just after midnight. Not my cell, the house phone we never used, the one we'd talked about unplugging and never did. I answered it without hesitation. "She's not accounted for," a calm voice said. Not asking, stating, "She's working," I replied. "She'll be back." A pause, brief and thoughtful, "Then remain active," the voice said. "This state is temporary." The line went dead, the hallway light brightened slightly, the radio came on in the kitchen, and the house held itself together through the rest of the night, awake in my place. By morning, I understood something that made my chest tighten. The house didn't see me as alone, it saw me as incomplete, and until that imbalance was resolved, it was prepared to stay awake as long as necessary. The third night arrived without the usual signals. No lights correcting themselves, no radio turning on. The house stayed dark and still longer than it should have, and that absence of response unsettled me more than the earlier adjustments ever had. I moved through the room slowly, turning on a lamp in the living room, then the kitchen, waiting for the familiar sense of insistence to return. It didn't. The house felt paused, as if it were waiting for confirmation before deciding how to proceed. My wife was scheduled to be gone again, another overnight shift added at the last minute. She texted to apologize, promised she'd be home early in the morning. I replied that it was fine and meant it, at least in the way you mean things you've already accepted. After I set the phone down, I noticed how quiet the house had become, not just silent, but unengaged. The warmth held steady, but it felt contained, like it was being rationed. I realized then that the house wasn't staying awake for me anymore, it was waiting for something else to resolve. I went to bed early, leaving the bedroom door open. Sleep came quickly and ended just as fast. I woke to the sound of movement in the hallway, not footsteps, not air shifting, but the soft, unmistakable sound of a door being closed carefully. I sat up and listened. The house remained quiet after that, its silence clean and finished. When I got out of bed and checked, every door was shut. Every light was off. The house had settled itself completely. The phone rang just before dawn. I answered it on the first ring, already standing in the kitchen, already aware that timing mattered. "She won't be returning tonight," the voice said calmly. I checked my phone immediately, panic cutting through my chest. There were no missed calls, no messages. I asked what they meant, my voice steady despite the tension building beneath it. "This state is no longer temporary," the voice replied. "Adjustments are required." The line went dead, the kitchen light brightened slightly, just enough to notice. Somewhere behind me, the living room radio clicked on, low and steady. The house was waking up again, not in anticipation, but in response. My wife called 10 minutes later. She sounded tired, frustrated. A storm had worsened conditions. Staffing issues meant she'd be staying another night, possibly two. She said she hated this part of the job, hated leaving me alone like this. I told her it was okay, but the words felt thinner this time, stretched too far to cover what they needed to. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen and understood the shift. The house wasn't reacting to her absence anymore, it had categorized it. What had once been a temporary imbalance had crossed into something else, something that required a different approach. The changes escalated quietly. The second pillow returned to the bed and stayed there. The dining table was set for two, plates aligned, chairs positioned evenly. The porch light remained on through the day, casting its glow against nothing. I moved through the house undoing these things, clearing the table, turning lights off, removing the pillow again. Each time, the house restored them within minutes, not angrily, not forcefully, just thoroughly, as if correcting an error in a report. That evening, I tried leaving. I put on my coat, picked up my keys, and stepped onto the porch. The house behind me went completely dark at once, every light shutting off in unison. The sudden absence stopped me in place. I turned back toward the door and felt a pressure settle in, not physical, but precise, like a boundary I hadn't noticed forming until I pressed against it. Inside, the lights came back on, slower this time, room by room. The radio resumed its low murmur, the warmth returned evenly. The house didn't punish the attempt, it acknowledged it and adjusted. I slept on the couch that night, fully dressed, listening to the house remain awake around me. I wasn't afraid, fear would have implied urgency. What I felt was recognition, the understanding that the house had chosen a solution, that didn't require waiting anymore. In the morning, my wife called again. She said she might need to transfer to a different unit, different hours. Things were changing, she asked if I was okay. I looked around the house as I answered, at the lights that stayed on, the spaces that refused to empty. I told her yes. After the call, the house finally settled. The radio turned off, the lights dimmed to normal levels. The second pillow remained, but it no longer felt provisional, it felt recorded. I understood then that the house hadn't been trying to keep me company, it had been trying to preserve balance. When one presence became unreliable, it compensated by stabilizing the other. Someone had to remain fully accounted for. Now, when I'm alone here at night, the house sleeps properly. It doesn't stay awake for her anymore. It doesn't wait, it has adapted, and when she does come home, late and exhausted, the house relaxes without question, as if nothing was ever out of place at all. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Before you drift back into the dark, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and which moment stayed with you the longest. Your whispers guide the night still waiting to unfold. Sleep well, if you can.